Hello everyone, today I am reviewing The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. Now, this obviously is a game that I played somewhat recently, and did not obviously play when it came out, so I was a little bit late to the party, and yeah. Morrowind definitely, its gameplay is definitely a little bit dated, and there are some mods I had to use to make things a little bit more palatable for my ADHD mindset, but the game overall is amazing. I see why people like this one out of all the Elder Scrolls, or why a lot of people still hark back to this time, mainly because I find that the lore and the story are actually strongest here. This is one of the few, I guess, the only Elder Scroll where I actually really cared a lot about the main quest. It was actually done very well and it's very interesting, and it was very spiritual. The basic setup is that you arrive as, on a slave ship to the port of, it's not at Balmore, but it's just south of it, I forget the name, but you arrive in the land of the Ashen Mountain, Vardenfell. In which, is the land of the Dunmer, which are the slang for the Dark Elves, and even the language in this game is so interesting because they have certain slang for different characters. It feels like a very much lived-in, drawn-up universe. This is very classic, high fantasy essentially, but it's done in a way that's very different. The fact that the Dunmer themselves are kind of considered a fallen race, it's a little bit of a tragedy in some way. But it's interesting. It's really interesting how you have this high fantasy setting, but like this is the odd version of it. Like these are the Dark Elves. This is kind of the alt, version, and the story that is not exactly the classic, hero story we get with the other installments of the game, like Morrowind and Oblivion, like Oblivion and Skyrim. So Morrowind is more so interesting because, again, you, especially, well, in this case, it's hard to even begin where to start. So you are the Nerevar, or the reincarnation of the Nerevar, who is this ancient Dunmer deity that essentially was betrayed, possibly in ancient times, and was around at the time when the Dunmer came into existence, technically. Essentially what the story is, and it's funny that I played this game actually before all the Dagoth memes came out. So to kind of give it a very brief summary, because again, like the lore here is actually very, very complex. So I'll just give a quick summary, spoiler-free version, which is that the Dunmer were a race of normal elves long ago, and there was also a race of dwarves known as the Dwemer. And they're the ones where whenever you're exploring a Dwemer, like, mine or ancient dungeon, essentially, all of these places that the dwarves left behind were these giant catacombs filled with highly technical and technically advanced machinery, along with things like steam power and other things, soul gems being powered by other things. And so, as the lore goes, the Dwemer basically were able to craft or create these items from the gods, which include things like the heart of Lorcan, which is this essence of one of the ancient gods of the Daedra, I believe. And so there's this whole thing about, there's the Daedra gods, there's the who are the old gods essentially, and they're kind of the gods of chaos and the primordial energies. And then there's the new gods, like the eight divines, and then eventually in Skyrim you have Talos, and it's all very much, an evolution of pagan ideas to different pagan ideas to a pseudo-Christian figure like Talos. The whole thing is super complicated, and I don't have a Elder Scrolls lore degree, as I'm sure some or most people do who have played Morrowind. But it is a really interesting setup. Anyway, the short and fast of it is that the Dwemer, by creating this item of Lorcan, this organic thing which was so powerful it could change the fabric of the universe, they essentially were at war with the elves at the time, and they used the heart to also build this giant mech. It was called Nebuchadnezzar or something. And basically during the final battle, something happened, and essentially by using these tools, all the Dwemer faded out of existence. And so that's why they're all gone now, and why they're all kind of ancient. It's actually funny that I think it breaks lore a little bit that there is actually one still living dwarf still alive in Morrowind itself, in part of the quest, where he is this giant fat guy who essentially has no legs and basically uses a spider machine that you see in the temples to essentially navigate around his little area. But yeah, so the Dwemer basically, go from existence, and this is what I love about Morrowind in general, is the fact that a lot of the story and the lore is left up to interpretation. So even the characters in the story, they're like, they don't know if they ascended to the plane of gods like they were intending. They don't know if they all just die. They don't know if they just, faded out of existence or went somewhere else or whatever. And so because of that, all of their items that they'd left behind, there were other items, keening the blade and other kind of a shield and a hammer as well, that basically were these items of the gods, basically, that held their essence. And so basically the elves that were left kind of were debating on whether or not they should use this or not. And so the two leaders at the time, there was Nerevar and Dagoth, who were essentially best friends, and they basically had to decide what to do with them. And again, the thing is that a part of the quest of the story is figuring out exactly, from reading the historical records in each one of the great houses, what exactly happened. Because Nerevar ended up being killed, while Dagoth stayed inside Red Mountain. And so essentially what occurs is Dagoth, Sithis Sil, and Vivek. Oh, there's also one more. I'm forgetting their name. It's the woman, like Elandra or something. They essentially use the power of these different items to essentially become immortal. And basically, it's really interesting because Vivek, using the power of these items, retains his original shape. So essentially what happens in this whole lore dump is that because Nerevar was killed, and it's unclear if he was betrayed or if he voluntarily died or sacrificed himself to stop, the giant mech or something. But it's kind of alluded to mostly that he was assassinated and betrayed. It was in this moment that Ashura, who was the god of the elves, basically, thought that they were sinful and had betrayed, their nature and their creation and her creation. And so for that, by her will or by some other event, she cursed all of them. And so the elves of the Ashen Lands became known as the Dunmer. And it's funny that this epic battle also takes place at Red Mountain, where the current boss of the game also resides. So essentially this is what transpires. And again, like I said, throughout the quest, you basically have to find out if you actually are the reincarnation by, analyzing the texts and, doing a little bit of campaigning politically, a little bit of assassination, and basically, bring the people to your side. And it's funny how it divides it up in the story, is that the first half, you're kind of convincing the tribal leaders. You will, in the very beginning, you kind of you arrive in Balmora, which is like a country kind of city in Vardenfell, and you basically meet a agent of the Empire who works for the Blades, and basically he puts you out on a bunch of quests, and you're basically investigating this cult, which is calling for the return, essentially, of these ancient gods, and they're basically causing a disturbance in the land. And so you start investigating this cult and this prophecy about the Neverine, rather. I'm not sure what the difference is between Nerevar and Neverine, but that definitely is something they also call you. And so the Neverine essentially is the reincarnation of the betrayed figure, or supposedly betrayed figure from the ancient times when the Dunmer, when the elves became the Dunmer and the dwarves disappeared from the world. And all this heavy stuff is being revealed, and in the process of investigating this cult, fighting them and restoring certain things to the land, you realize you're actually fulfilling parts of the prophecy for the signs of the return of the Nerevarine. Nerevarine. And so and so basically you realize that you might be the chosen one, and similar to honestly what they do in Oblivion, the leader of the Blades is like, oh, I think you're the chosen guy. And then he's like, okay. And after that kind of initial thing in Balmora and the surrounding area, your next job is to kind of convince all of the tribespeople throughout the land, which is also part of the prophecy. So you go to each tribe that live in sort of nomadically, and they all have a problem. They all give you a task, and so you go there, do that, and gain their trust, and that's part of fulfilling the prophecy. And then finally, at the midpoint of the game, you go through this kind of spirit quest in this cave where you commune with Ashura, and of course, yeah, you actually are the reincarnation. Like oh, go figure. And then the latter half of the game, you spend your time convincing the actual cities and the main houses and the people essentially in power that you are the chosen one. And once all that has been created, you can finally, get the key essentially from a Dwemer holding, I believe, to take down the shields around Red Mountain and take on the final boss of the game, which I'll talk about later. And so the main thing that's going on at the time when you arrive in Vardenfell is that there is a plague called the Blight going around, and essentially it's spreading from Red Mountain, and it's basically creating evil creatures and causing disease amongst people, and you can actually get the status elements of this disease, and then people won't talk to you. They'll kind of scorn you, and they'll have special dialogue just for the case when you have the disease. So that's kind of a big summary of leaning over the story in Morrowind, which really is its strongest point. I really, really like the story in Morrowind. It's very interesting, and again, the fact that there is a real culture in Vardenfell, the fact that the Dunmer have their own slur for non-Dunmer, which is Nawa, and it's hard to pronounce even. The fact that you learn about the history of Vivec City, and I think the coolest thing in the entire game actually is the fact that you're captured in the main jail of Vivec City. You're thrown into it, and the jail itself is this weird. It's a meteor that's floating just above the city palace, which apparently was originally a comet that was heading for the city, and Vivec, I believe, was able to use his magic to basically stop it in its tracks. And by doing that, it just kind of always just stayed there, and then they literally made a ladder, climbed up to it, and hollowed it out and turned it into a prison, of all things. So it's so I just love that. It's so cool that you have random things in the environment that don't make any sense, but they've been written into the world. Things that are just they don't essentially fit a very clean cut story. It's like, oh, all these mistakes happened and we built around them. It's such an interesting, cool way of writing stories and writing real lore that feels like it's a real lived in place, that yes, there are these weird things that were unexpected, and we've integrated them into our little world. It makes it feel more real. Anyway, so that is kind of a brief summary. But how is the other aspects of Morrowind? So the gameplay. So yeah, this is where I definitely had an issue. The fact that I would hit the enemy, and you have a good chance to do 0 damage if you're using a fighting style you're not familiar with. So if you're doing two-handed or one-handed, and you're at level 1 to 10, there's a lot of times you'll do 0 damage, to the point where I lost fights to like little worms and rats and stuff like that. Yeah, not great. So yeah, the other thing too, so I mean, I'll be honest, I installed a mod where I didn't want to break it too much, so I just like increased my learning speed by like, I don't know, 5 or 10 times or so. So it's like, okay, I can just not worry about the mechanics of actually, worrying about this thing. It is interesting though in other games where the more you do a certain act, the more you level up. So this game also has very weird, I would say, esoteric stats. Like there's one for like running and then one for aerobics. So every time you jump, you can like possibly level up that as well. And you basically level up each stat individually. There's not like an overall level up thing. That just happens naturally as time goes on. So, and besides that, I also installed a speed mod so I could just run faster. There's nothing worse than wanting to get to somewhere and you just can't go there very quickly, and you are pretty darn slow when you do start the game. But those are the only two main ones I really, frankly, needed in order to properly play this game. That being said, though, that doesn't mean you're going to get lost in the atmosphere. Morrowind is a very atmospheric game. I find atmospheres in games are a lot like, I don't know, paintings. They can just give you a very distinct and certain vibe. And so Morrowind itself, similar to its predecessors, but I would see it even more so than its successors, rather. It has a very big mood about it, and of course a lot of that is because of the excellent music in the game. But also it has little atmospheric things like, the croaking of, weird frogs or something. It's kind of funny, too, that there's a lot of fantasy stuff in this game that is unconventional. Like, Oblivion and Morrowind have, like, yes, there are knights and dragons and, all the things you'd expect. But in here, there's only things where you see things like Gwar and like the still swift riders that you ride to get around. Like there's things in this game that look honestly alien or just downright odd, and you don't see things like that in other fantasy games. Like they're just specific to Morrowind. This is Morrowind fantasy. I know I called it high fantasy, but it's Morrowind fantasy. It's its own brand of thing, and it's just so interesting. Other gameplay mechanics that are also extremely painful and outdated is, for example, things like the journal, or lack thereof. So I didn't really realize this. I mean, we're really going back, but back in the day, an NPC would give you a quest, and you basically had to remember everything. Like, it's kind of crazy, and it's the one thing where I'm like, no, I don't want I've never wanted games to hold my hand, but in this case, I kind of needed them to. So there's a journal in this game, and it logs all of your actions, but it does not differentiate between the main quest and side quests. So if you need to know what to do in a side quest, and fortunately, I kind of, only worked on a side quest and finished that to completion and then, went to that thing. But if you do a side quest here, a side quest there, main quest there, and you look at your journal, it's going to be jumbled just in chronological order of all the updated things that you have to do. And it is very, very hard to sort out what is going on unless you do one thing at one time, or you in real life write down the quests that you need to do in the game, which is just insane and very, very old school. There are also just very different spells and things in here. There are like things like potions of what was it? Levitation, illumination, stuff like that. But the fact that you can get a potion, oh, there's a potion for running on water, like just really cool, weird things that they added in just because they don't really make sense in a lore way, really, but it's like a cool gameplay thing. Like, yeah, sure, I'll let the character run on water. Why not? Really just cool stuff like that. Aside from all your normal things like being able to breathe underwater more, or health and mana and magic and all that stuff. Again, the weapons in this game, again, everything's low poly, but it still has an attitude and a feel to it. Speaking on just all of that, the inventory screen, oh my god, it's kind of awful. It's just so archaic. Like this feels like the first inventory screen ever made. I know it wasn't, but that's what it feels like, at least for me as a more modern perspective. Like, for example, when you bring up your menu, you'll have multiple screens and you can move them all around. The map itself, everything, every city is represented with a square, and it's just, it feels like, like a reskinned Microsoft 95 web browser, basically, is what it feels like, with the scroll bars and everything. It just feels very archaic. There's no other way to put it. Of course, like all the little sprite art for like all the items is also kind of charming, I guess, in a way. And your character itself is also very low poly, but there's some cool armors you could get by the end of it. I think I ended up with some kind of, by the end of the game, I had some kind of like, magic casting specific robe that had a cool effect on it, and like an orcish helmet with a katana. So they're like, this game has kind of like, the style aspects of, its future games, so to speak. Again, the music is really good. Even the taverns, the battle theme. There's actually this game actually had a battle theme called like on Death's Charge or something that isn't in the future games, really. It's just kind of surprising that was the case. In general, though, I would say that you realize that the Elder Scrolls like Oblivion, Morrowind, Skyrim, they're all the same theme. They just added more and more instruments. What's also interesting, I guess, talking about this series in general, is that, you realize that each game kind of adopts one of the symbols from, the previous games. So, the fact that, oh yeah, you see the dragon on the Imperial doors in Oblivion, and that becomes the main symbol for Skyrim. But anyway, the main symbols are also found in the game world itself, and you're kind of like, oh cool, they're like doing this theme now, which is really neat. But yeah, just speaking on the distinct animals that are in Morrowind that don't show up elsewhere, also the bone meal armor, which, I mean, it was DLC in I think like Skyrim or something, but the aesthetics of the armor and the houses and the culture and lore of Morrowind is just really, really interesting. What has been consistent, though, between all three games has been there's always been a minorities of, Khajiit and Imperials and Argonians and other races throughout the realm. And you still find that in the big cities. You'll find like a diversity of different races kind of living there in the same, amount or capacity, usually, I feel. Another thing that is interesting / frustrating is that the dialogue and the way the dialogue works in this game is sometimes it'll be voice and it usually won't be. If you walk up to the random person, the way the dialogue works is that it'll just pop up all the dialogue and text all at once. There's no like even transition of text onto the screen to show how fast they're talking. It just pops up, and then there's gonna be blue like points of interest, and you click those blue points to kind of find out more about it. And it's kind of like a branching tree of just dialogue boxes that's very archaic. And by navigating through the right dialogue boxes, you can find out a side quest or something. Again, this game still has the different skills, the star sign you're born under, all that good stuff. It also has, Bandits in the Wild and, other sort of side quests. Lots of Dwemer kind of, dungeons to explore. Very similar to Skyrim. You have a bunch of copy-pasted dungeons. Stuff like that. The merchants and markets work pretty much the same. You sell a bunch of stuff, they're out of gold. You fast travel around or come back later, they have more gold. Everything seems pretty much the same. The only big difference, honestly, between Morrowind and the future games, besides how it looks, is the fact that the main story is actually really good and probably the most driving factor of the game, rather than the side quests and the world itself, which is kind of cool. Not that the world is bad, mind you. It's just that the main quest is just legitimately really good. And just, they just have they just have a different thing for everything. Like, they have these pterodactyl-esque things called cliff runners. Like, everything in Skyrim and Oblivion is kind of like normal fantasy stuff, while Morrowind is just weird fantasy stuff that just doesn't exist or has not been seen yet, ever. But you're going to get the same kind of vibes. You go into a dungeon, you like navigate around a bunch of copy-pasted rooms, you find a note on a guy that says they were planning this assassination, and then you find like the leader who's a wizard in the back, and you kill him and cheesing it if you have to. And yeah, I mean that's pretty much the game. The one vibe I got from this game that I didn't expect is that I'm not exactly sure what they're going for, but what the vibe that I did get was that all the tribal nomadic Dunmer live in yurts, so it kind of has a Mongolian kind of vibe to it at a certain point, which I was just like, oh, okay, I didn't expect that to happen. Again, what's also interesting about this game is also whenever you talk to any individual, their persuasion or charisma bar or reputation bar with you is always displayed. And, it's actually pretty easy to basically bribe the guards in this game, or, if your skill level's high enough, you can talk to them. But if you just, bribe the guards, you can basically just get their reputation up to 100. If you overbribe them, however, it'll go down, which is really interesting. So it's the right amount of pizzazz, I guess, that you use. What's also interesting is the way the map is laid out is you kind of have to travel to every major city to make it pop up. The map itself doesn't change, but it'll populate a square or a little node on it if you have visited that area. And so Vardenfell is decently sized. Again, I feel like they do have the typical formula for the Elder Scrolls games where, there's always like a little creature running across the highway, maybe a side quest or someone getting attacked. They still have that kind of feeling and vibe, even back then in this game. That being said, I feel like, it's almost very similar to the sequels. I was going to say that, you walk across the countryside and you find a bunch of copy-pasted dungeons and you can enter into at your own peril, but it really is very much the same thing over and over and over again, which isn't really new, or really is the same thing as the future game. The only other fun facts I know about this game is that there was the 36 lessons, the 36 lessons of Vivek, which was essentially the lessons for how to achieve Chim, which again is the state of like Nirvana essentially in the Morrowind universe. And there's so many interesting terms and expressions in this game that it really is kind of so unique from the other games in that aspect. But apparently the guy who wrote the 36 Lessons of Vivek actually did take LSD and locked himself in his house or in the studio or something for a week, and he was just completely zonked out of his mind and spent a week tripping while writing these enlightening documents, which I just think is the funniest thing. That's the kind of game developers we need making our games today. We need people going into outer space to get crazy ideas and bringing it back to us. The other funny thing is that, besides, gold cups and, saucers and all that stuff, you have weird things like, candlesticks, forks, knives, a lot more collectible, pick-upable objects in the world that are completely useless that they obviously cut down on in future games as they realized, why is this even here? People don't really need to pick this up. And I feel like that's even a thing that, was even an issue in Starfield. From a game design principle, why would you need to pick up all this stuff? It's cool, you can pick it up and analyze it and rotate it and whatever, but what is its actual purpose itself? Not just to resell. It's interesting. So, in the latter half of the game, There's certain side quests which are funny. When you have to convince the main houses, one of them has a political, campaign against you, or they're having a political dispute rather. And so between the two of them, you actually need to either do propaganda or assassination or something of the sort. You can also be thrown in jail in this game, and your stats will decrease. And again, it's like the Empire is in Morrowind, and they're like kind of controlling or trying to control the area, and you're kind of like rising up against them as a local. The only funny thing, I guess, is that because you can choose whatever race and class you want to be at the beginning of the game. Basically, the Neverine, which was originally a elf, or before they became Dunmer, reincarnated essentially as a you could become a Khajiit or whatever. And again, like the stereotypes against some of these characters are just absolutely 100% accurate, or just very extreme, rather. For example, like the Argonians of the Dark Marsh, which is adjacent to Vardenfell, are kind of like seen as a slave race that the Dunmer enslaved at a certain point in history, and so they're seen as second-class citizens. And there's a lot of resentment, of course, against the Empire. Apparently, Vivek, though, is interesting because in his appearance, he was actually able, using his magic and Chim or whatever, he was able to revert to what the elves of the Dunmer originally looked like, which is just normal elves, frankly. And throughout the campaign, you'll meet the three, living survivors of, the calamity from Red Mountain, and basically try to have them ally with you. Which brings us to the final part of the game, which is very interesting, where you go to the heart of Red Mountain and you confront essentially Dagoth and find out why the blight is spreading out of Red Mountain, which I won't spoil. But basically, you need to, confront him, and when you do in this moment, it's one of the rare cases where, there have been like certain lines of dialogue throughout the campaign where, people say "oh" or "hello," or they'll have their one-liners, very similar to the other games. But Dagoth doesn't actually have a text box, or not many text boxes. When you meet him, he's all dialogue, and in a game where it's mostly non-dialogue, it makes a big impact on the player. And I think the reason why people like Dagoth as a character so much is that, you are essentially his long-lost friend. You are his best friend from like 1,000 years ago when they were fighting together, and someone or something, again, betrayed the Neverine. And, it might have been Dagoth himself. And again, I think it's up to the interpretation of the player, but also I think there's an official thing that Bethesda officially says. But I like to think it's better since it's up to interpretation. But it's better that, it's interesting that Dagoth, he's like so romanticized with you because you are his best friend. But at the same time, it's been so long that he's gone insane. And he has this, this warrior's pride, where he essentially, wants to fight or preserve, what he's doing and whatever his mission is. But he also sees you as a dear friend, and he really does care for you, like you're almost his family. And that's why I think initially in those like he only has not so much dialogue, and just from that one interaction, he's such an iconic and memorable character, and honestly just very, very interesting and shockingly emotional. Just from the way he talks, he's endeared to you, but also is, he says things like, your foolishness, Neverine. Come, be my friend. Do not try to fight a god. What an intoxicating innocence to think you could kill a god. And so he's almost like this father figure. I don't know, but he's definitely one of the more interesting and very short-lived characters I've seen in video games, and a very interesting villain who, needs to basically be stopped for his own good. And he basically thinks the same of you, that in any other case, you two would be best friends. And that's such an interesting dynamic. Just from being the big bad guy, he's actually your friend that you are fighting. And that's a very interesting dynamic, which I really like. And again, it's such a short-lived moment near the end of the game, but it has a huge impact on how you walk away from it. And of course, again, once it's all dealt with, you can explore the world and discover the side quests. But there's also DLC for this game, and I played a little bit of it, but really wasn't super into it. I might come back and play it later, but it's like you go to the island where Sothis Sil is, and you kind of discover all the other aspects of the lore. But again, this is the one game where it's so interesting that, well, one, it forces you to read like historical framed documents, or documents that are trying to sound like history almost, and try to piece together your side of the story and present it to the council essentially. Everything in this game feels, I don't know, very real in a way. Everything feels, I don't know how to put it. Morrowind is just a very specific feel, and I really do treasure and cherish it for that purpose and for that sake. And it's definitely worth still playing today, even if you just go through the main campaign, which I did. I don't know if there's more outside of that, because I wasn't really interested, frankly. I was kind of just ready to move on. But it's a really good story, and it's very interesting, and it's something that you could obviously see in internet culture, that Morrowind is just this thing that lives on. It just continues on, and it's almost different and very distinct from the other Elder Scrolls games. It does its own thing, and it does it weirdly and proudly. And with that being said, I think I will leave you to experience the prophecy and drug-fueled story of Morrowind. Anyway, guys, that's it for this video, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.